What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
Imagine this. You're standing in a gleaming courtroom, the judge's gavel crashing down like a final nail in your coffin, stripping away your dream home, your kids' laughter echoing in empty rooms. All because that silver-tongued snake you called a husband twisted every word until you looked like the villain. I did. And with nothing but a beat-up suitcase and a tank of gas, I drove back to the one place that couldn't lie to me, my dead mother's forgotten farmhouse, where the dust was thicker than my regrets. But as I scraped away the grime, something glinted behind the fireplace, a secret my mom hid like her ace in the hole, whispering promises of payback that could shatter everything all over again. Stick with me, because what I found inside that safe didn't just change the game, it rewrote the rules, and I'm still figuring out if I won or just traded one hell for another. I never thought I'd be the woman dragging her sorry self back to a sagging old farmhouse in the middle of Ohio nowhere, the kind of place where the wind howls through cracked windows like it's got a grudge. But there I was after that courtroom nightmare. My life in tatters because of Mark, that self-righteous real estate hotshot who'd charmed his way into my heart and then bulldozed right through it. It started with the usual cracks in our marriage, the late nights he claimed were for closing deals on those McMansions sprouting up around Cleveland, but I knew better even then. Catching whiffs of cheap perfume on his collars and excuses that piled up like unpaid bills, yet I stayed quiet for the kids. Emily with her sharp teenage wit that cut through my delusions, and little Jack whose gap-toothed grin made every compromise feel worthwhile. Until the day I found those bank statements tucked in his golf bag, showing he'd funneled our savings into some offshore nonsense while preaching family values at every barbecue. The divorce turned vicious fast, Mark hiring that shark of a lawyer who painted me as the unstable one, the gold digger who'd married above her station, and despite my pleas about how he'd gambled away our nest egg on bad investments, the judge, a stern woman with eyes like chipped flint, sided with him, awarding him the $3.5 million mansion we'd built from scratch, the one with the pool where Jack learned to swim, and the backyard where Emily buried her first pet hamster, and worse, temporary custody of the children because apparently my emotional outbursts made me unfit, leaving me with a pittance alimony that wouldn't cover a studio apartment, let alone therapy for the hole in my chest. I drove out of there in my rusty sedan, the skyline fading in the rearview like a bad dream I couldn't wake from, heading to Mom's place in rural Medina County, the farmhouse she'd left me in her will 5 years back after cancer took her too quick, a sprawling two-story relic from her days as a schoolteacher married to my dad who ran off when I was 8, abandoning us to this patch of overgrown fields and silence that now felt like the only honest thing left in my world. Pulling up the gravel drive, the tires crunching over weeds that had claimed the yard, I sat there staring at the peeling white paint and the porch swing creaking in the breeze. Memories flooding back of summer evenings when Mom would shell peas on that very swing while telling stories about her own hard-knock youth during the farm crisis of the 80s. How she'd clawed her way through community college on waitressing tips to give me a shot at something better, and I wondered if she was up there shaking her head at how I'd squandered it all on a man who treated commitment like a disposable contract. Stepping inside, the air hit me thick with dust and that musty scent of forgotten time, furniture draped in yellowed sheets like ghosts at a funeral, and I dropped my bags in the kitchen where the linoleum curled at the edges, vowing to clean it up bit by bit if only to keep my hands busy and my mind from replaying the judge's words that still echoed like a bad radio signal. I started with the living room that afternoon, sunlight slanting through grimy panes to highlight cobwebs that swayed like party streamers from a wake, wiping down shelves lined with Mom's knickknacks. Faded porcelain figurines from county fairs and photo albums bulging with pictures of me as a gangly kid riding bikes down these dirt roads, and as I moved to the fireplace, its stone mantel chipped from years of neglect, my rag snagged on a loose brick that gave way with a soft thud, revealing not just mortar dust, but a small metal door embedded in the wall, a hidden safe about the size of a bread box, its dial glinting dully under the layer of grime, and my heart skipped because Mom had never mentioned anything like this. Not in all her stories of pinching pennies or hiding Christmas gifts. making me wonder what other secrets she'd buried in this house of whispers. But before I could twist that dial, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, a grainy photo of Mark at some gala looking flustered, his tie askew, and I realized I'd sent an anonymous tip to his golf buddies group chat earlier that week. A silly snapshot from our honeymoon where he'd tripped into a fountain, nothing damning, but enough to make those smug jerks chuckle and remind him that even kings slip sometimes, a tiny spark of satisfaction warming me as I stared at that safe. Knowing whatever was inside might fuel something bigger, something that could drag him down from his pedestal without me lifting a finger, or so I hoped, until the next buzz came, this one from Emily, her message cold and accusing, pulling me right back into the mess I'd barely escaped. That text from Emily lingered like a bad aftertaste as I knelt by the fireplace the next morning, the farmhouse's chill seeping through the floorboards despite the autumn sun trying to push through the lace curtains Mom had hung decades ago. Her way of softening the harsh lines of rural life that she'd always said built character even when it broke your back, and I couldn't shake the girl's words. "Dad says you're stirring up trouble again, Mom. Just stop," because Mark had always been the master at turning our kids against me in subtle ways, planting seeds of doubt during his custody weekends with tales of how I was the one who'd driven us apart, never mentioning his own flings with that assistant half his age or the way he'd maxed out our credit cards on fantasy football bets disguised as business expenses. Manipulations that started small, but snowballed into the courtroom circus where his lawyer paraded emails I'd sent in frustration as proof of my hysteria, twisting my concerns about his gambling into evidence against me while he played the stable provider, complete with character witnesses from his country club crowd who painted our life together as some idyllic suburbia I'd supposedly poisoned. I set the phone aside on the mantel cluttered with Mom's old brass candlesticks, their tarnish mirroring the dull ache in my chest, and focused on the safe instead. Its combination lock mocking me with numbers that felt too personal to guess at random, since Mom had always been the type to layer her secrets with sentiment, wiping away the dust to reveal faint scratches around the edges as if she'd opened it in haste once or twice during those sleepless nights after Dad left, when she'd pace the living room confiding in me about bills that piled higher than the corn in the fields, teaching me early on that trust was a luxury we couldn't always afford in a world quick to take from single moms like us. After a few futile tries based on her wedding date or the year she bought the place with that small inheritance from her own mother, my fingers hesitated over the dial before punching in my own birthday, June 14th, 1977. The one she'd celebrated with homemade devil's food cake every year until her hands got too shaky from the chemo, marking it with stories of my birth during a thunderstorm that she swore was nature's way of announcing a fighter, and to my shock, the tumblers clicked into place with a satisfying whir that echoed through the empty room like a long-held breath released. The door swinging open to reveal not stacks of cash or jewelry that might have tempted lesser women into daydreams of quick fixes, but a single yellowed envelope sealed with a blob of red wax that had cracked like old veins from time's relentless pressure. The front scrawled in Mom's looping handwriting that I recognized from countless report cards and birthday cards. "This secret has always been my trump card," words that sent a shiver down my spine. Because she'd used phrases like that when teaching me poker during those long winters huddled by this very fireplace, her eyes twinkling as she bluffed her way to winning my allowance with hands that were mediocre at best. Always saying a good hand was only as strong as the story you told around it, a lesson I'd forgotten in my rush to build a life with Mark who promised security but delivered strings attached to every gift. I carried it to the kitchen table, though it's scarred from years of family meals that now seemed like another life filled with laughter over pot roast and arguments about whose turn it was to wash dishes, and slid it open with a butter knife dulled from disuse. Unfolding pages brittle as autumn leaves that smelled faintly of lavender soap, the kind Mom favored for its calming scent during her teaching days when she'd come home exhausted from corralling rowdy third graders in a one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town, and the first lines hit me like a gut punch. Straight to the remnants of the optimism I'd clung to since the divorce. "Sarah, if you're reading this, things have gone south worse than I feared, and this is the ace I've held since before you were born, proof that some men build empires on lies." And yours might be one of them. Watch for the initials EL in his dealings, the shadow that follows his success, a ghost from my past that I thought buried, but which clings like morning fog over the river. My mind reeled as I pieced it together under the harsh light of the single bulb swinging overhead. Remembering how Mark had swept into my life 15 years ago at a Chamber of Commerce mixer in Akron, where I'd been networking for a real estate assistant job after putting my own dreams on hold to support his climb. All polished shoes and promises of stability that contrasted sharply with my string of dead-end jobs post-college, where I'd bounced between waitressing and office temp work, scraping by in a tiny apartment until he dangled the vision of a shared future. But now this hinted at something rotten at the core of his charm, perhaps tied to Evelyn's own past. Wait, EL, could that be her initials before marriage? Evelyn Larson. Something she'd buried deep when marrying my dad and settling into this farmhouse life. A connection that made Mark's meteoric rise from small-time flipper to mansion magnate feel less like luck and more like an inheritance from a deal she regretted. One that explained the uneasy glances she'd shot him during family holidays when he'd boast about snapping up foreclosed properties at bargain prices during the housing bust. I spent the afternoon poring over those pages by the window where the fields stretched out golden under the fading sun, cross-referencing faded newspaper clippings tucked inside about a land scandal in the 90s involving developers and foreclosed farms like the one we'd nearly lost ourselves, clues that Mark's firm had snapped up properties under the table with creative accounting that skirted the edges of legality, and a surge of anger mixed with that old guilt because I'd ignored Mom's warnings years back when she met him for the first time at our engagement party, calling him too smooth for his own good. Like a fox eyeing the henhouse while pretending to guard it, but I'd laughed it off as her protective instincts flaring up from Dad's betrayal. Too enamored with the life he dangled, the big house in the suburbs with its granite counters and home theater, the minivan loaded with soccer gear and school projects, the illusion of the American dream that turned out to be built on sand shifting under pressure from his hidden debts and affairs. As dusk fell, painting the walls in shadows that danced like uneasy spirits across the floral wallpaper peeling at the corners, I decided to test the waters of this newfound power without diving in headfirst. Firing off an anonymous email to a local business blog I'd followed during our marriage for tips on market trends, tipping them about Mark's questionable property flips with just enough detail from the clippings to pique interest without naming names or revealing my source, phrasing it as a concerned insider who hated seeing good people get burned. And by evening, as I heated up a can of soup on the stove that rattled like it had a complaint of its own, sure enough, an article popped up online under the glow of my laptop screen, vague but stinging in its implications, questioning his ethics in a way that had his Facebook blowing up with concerned emojis and probing comments from colleagues who'd once fawned over his every deal, a petty thrill running through me as I imagined his face reddening over his evening scotch in that mansion that should have been ours. That smug jerk finally tasting a sliver of the humiliation he'd dealt me in court when his lawyer cross-examined me about my overspending on family vacations while he hid assets in shell companies. But just as I leaned back in the creaky chair, savoring the small victory that felt like the first crack in his armor after months of feeling powerless, the phone rang with a blocked number that made my stomach twist, and when I answered after 3 rings that stretched like eternity, a man's voice, gruff, familiar yet distorted as if run through gravel, said my name like an accusation drawn out slow, mentioning the farmhouse and something about family business unfinished that tied straight back to those initials EL in the letter, leaving me frozen with the receiver clutched in my hand as the line went dead, wondering if Mom's trump card was about to pull me into a game far bigger and more dangerous than I'd bargained for. One where the players knew my moves before I even made them. The voice on that call hung in my ears like an unwelcome guest crashing a family reunion the following day as I paced the farmhouse kitchen, the coffee percolating on the old stove filling the air with a bitter aroma that matched my mood perfectly. Because whoever it was had known too much about the safe and Mom's writings, dropping details that made my skin crawl with the realization that this secret wasn't just buried in dust, but alive in someone's memory, perhaps a loose end from her past. who'd been waiting for me to stir things up, and I couldn't shake the fear that Mark's influence extended further than I'd imagined. His network of real estate cronies, possibly including folks from Mom's era who could sniff out trouble like hounds on a scent. I poured a mug strong enough to strip paint, the steam rising in curls that blurred the window overlooking the barn where Dad used to tinker with tractors before vanishing one rainy night, leaving Mom to explain his absence with stories of wanderlust that I now suspected hid deeper pains, and it hit me hard that unraveling this could drag up ghosts I'd thought laid to rest, forcing me to confront not just Mark's lies, but the fractures in my own family history that I'd papered over with suburban bliss. Realizing I couldn't unravel this alone with shadows closing in, not with the divorce still fresh and my alimony checks bouncing like bad checks in a poker game, I dialed Lisa, my college roommate from Kent State who'd stuck by me through the early marriage squabbles and the divorce mess with her no-nonsense advice delivered over late-night calls from her accounting office in Columbus. The kind of friend who saw through baloney faster than anyone and always said I deserved better than the country club con man I'd hitched my wagon to back when I was 25 and starry-eyed about his big plans. She arrived by noon, her sensible sedan kicking up dust on the gravel drive as she hugged me tight on the porch, her laugh cutting through the tension when she quipped about the place looking like a set from one of those ghost hunting shows we binged in our 20s during finals week, trading horror stories over cheap pizza to blow off steam. But her eyes sobered quick when I showed her the envelope spread out on the kitchen table amid crumbs from my hasty breakfast. The pages whispering secrets that linked Mom's youth to a web of shady land deals in the 80s, when developers like the ones Mark emulated scooped up failing farms during the recession that hit Ohio hard, wiping out families who'd poured their souls into soil only to watch banks foreclose without mercy. And there it was in black and white, the EL monogram on a crumpled receipt tucked inside, standing for Evelyn Larson, Mom's maiden name from before she became the steadfast Ellis, something she'd buried when marrying Dad and settling into this life of lesson plans and PTA meetings, a connection that made Mark's rise feel engineered from her regrets, perhaps a distant relation or business tie she'd tried to sever, but which looped back like a bad investment. Lisa's brow furrowed as she scanned the documents with the precision of someone who'd audited her share of crooked books, her calculator mind piecing together how this could expose Mark's empire as built on pilfered equity from those very farms. Perhaps even tying back to why he'd fought so dirty for the mansion in court, not just out of spite to punish me for discovering his affair, but to bury any traces of inherited dirt that could tank his reputation among the investors who fawned over his golf swing more than his morals, and we spent hours there under the ticking of the wall clock that Mom wound every Sunday like a ritual. Her sketching timelines on a notepad pulled from a drawer stuffed with old bills and recipes, while I recounted Mom's vague warnings over the years that I dismissed as overprotectiveness, like that time after our wedding when she'd pulled me aside at the reception amid the clink of champagne glasses and forced smiles, murmuring about debts that follow like bad luck from one generation to the next, before clamming up when Mark approached with his arm around my waist, leaving me to wave it off as her old-fashioned paranoia born from Dad's abandonment during the farm's leanest years and the foreclosure threats she'd battled alone with side gigs sewing quilts for neighbors. The revelation stirred a storm in me, anger at Mark for weaving himself into my family, like a parasite sucking the life from roots I'd never fully understood, but also a pang of regret for not listening sooner to Mom's instincts sharpened by years of scraping by, for choosing the shiny allure of his promises, the private schools for the kids, the annual trips to Florida beaches where we'd build sandcastles that washed away like our vows, over her quiet counsel that now rang true as a warning bell, a choice that made me question if I'd failed not just her, but Emily and Jack too, by modeling a marriage built on illusions rather than the gritty honesty she'd taught me through example. Especially when my phone lit up mid-conversation with a message from Emily, out of the blue after weeks of radio silence that had gnawed at me like termites in the floorboards. "Hey Mom, can I come see you this weekend? Dad's being weird about stuff at home, like he's on edge all the time," her words tentative yet laced with that teenage vulnerability she rarely showed. Cracking open the fragile bond I'd feared was lost forever amid Mark's custody manipulations where he'd fill her head with tales of my instability to keep her loyal, and I typed back yes before doubt could creep in like fog over the fields, imagining her pulling up here with questions about the divorce that simmered unspoken, her sharp wit turning inward as she navigated loyalty to both parents in a split that no kid deserved. Lisa noticed my distraction and suggested we dig deeper into the envelope's folds, spotting a small brass key taped to the inner flap that didn't fit the safe's mechanism but hinted at another layer, and as we hunted for its match around the house, lifting dusty floorboards in the hallway that creaked like old bones and peering into closets thick with mothballs and forgotten coats from my childhood winters, we found a locked wooden box stashed under Mom's bed upstairs in her room that still smelled of her talcum powder, its surface carved with the same yell initials in delicate script, the key sliding in with a click that echoed my quickening pulse, revealing not more papers, but a tiny cassette tape labeled in her handwriting for Sarah, play when ready, but only if you're strong enough. Its label peeling like an old promise waiting to be kept, and my pulse raced because whatever voices from the grave were captured on there could be the real meat of Mom's trump card, recordings that might finally give me the leverage to fight for my kids in court. Or expose Mark's underbelly without dragging everyone down. But just as I reached for the ancient tape player gathering dust in the attic, amid boxes of holiday decorations we'd unpacked together every December, tires crunched on the gravel outside. Slow and deliberate, and Lisa whispered a warning from the window about unexpected visitors pulling up in a truck that looked too purposeful for a neighbor, leaving me clutching that tape like a grenade with the pin half pulled, heart pounding with the fear that opening it might blow up more than just Mark's world. It could shatter the fragile piece I'd started to rebuild here. In the meantime, I'd already set another will in motion that morning before Lisa arrived, spoofing an email from Mark's assistant using a throwaway account I'd set up in a fit of insomnia, rescheduling his crucial lunch meeting with a big investor for the wrong day across town with a cheeky note about prioritizing family time over deals, and by afternoon as we huddled over the box, social media buzzed with leaks of his frantic apologies and the client's snide reply about unreliability, a witty little jab that had me smirking despite the dread coiling in my gut. Because watching that control freak squirm over missed handshakes felt like the first real breath I'd taken since the courtroom gavel fell, even as the knock at the door downstairs echoed like impending doom, pulling me toward a confrontation I wasn't sure I could bluff my way through. The knock turned out to be my brother Tom, older by 5 years and carrying that same lanky build as Dad with shoulders slumped from years of hauling engine parts, showing up unannounced in his battered pickup truck loaded with tools he claimed were for fixing up the place before it falls down around your ears. But I saw right through the brotherly act as he lumbered into the kitchen with a toolbox clanging at his side, his eyes darting straight to the wooden box and scattered papers on the table like a hawk spotting easy prey, and Lisa, ever the quick thinker, slipped out the back door with a quick thumbs up and a murmured promise to call later, leaving me to face this family interloper alone in the space that suddenly felt too small for old resentments bubbling up from the woodwork. Tom had always been the golden boy in Mom's eyes, the one she doted on with extra slices of pie during holidays while dishing out stern talks to me about pulling my weight after school, and he'd skipped her funeral 5 years back claiming a work emergency at his auto shop in Toledo that I later learned was more about dodging emotional scenes than fixing transmissions. But now here he was, circling the farmhouse like a realtor eyeing a flip, casually mentioning how the land could fetch a tidy sum from developers sniffing around for suburban sprawl. Ironic given the secrets it held about exactly that kind of opportunism, and as he cracked open a soda from the fridge with a familiar pop that echoed our childhood squabbles over the last one, I folded the envelope away carefully, my mind racing to keep the tape hidden in my pocket while he rambled on about how I'd let the property rot into a money pit since inheriting it, never admitting the real it was his own financial squeezes from a bad divorce of his own that left him scraping by on alimony payments to an ex who sounded a lot like Mark in her demands, with him hovering like a bad habit, filling the air with talk of patching the roof and selling off the back acre. I couldn't risk playing the cassette right then, so I played hostess out of habit, brewing fresh coffee in the percolator that gurgled like it resented the intrusion. Steering the conversation to neutral ground about mutual cousins and the latest high school football scores from back home. But inside I seethed, because his casual drop about overhearing Mark at a family barbecue years ago, boasting about old Larson connections that greased the wheels, made my blood run cold, suggesting even Tom had caught wind of the Yale tangle without ever bothering to warn me or Mom. A betrayal that stung deeper than the divorce papers still crumpled in my glove compartment, turning what little sibling bond we had left into another thread fraying under pressure. As evening settled in with crickets starting their chorus outside the screen door, Tom crashed on the living room couch after insisting on helping with dinner by grilling burgers on the rusty patio set that Mom used for church potlucks, his snores rumbling soon after like thunder rolling in from the fields, and I retreated to the barn where the air hung heavy with the scent of hay bales stacked high from harvests long past, the structure's rafters sagging under pigeon nests that cooed softly in the dim lantern light I hung from a beam, finally pulling out the dusty tape player from a shelf cluttered with Dad's forgotten tools, and hitting play with fingers that trembled despite the resolve hardening in my chest. Mom's voice crackled to life like she'd stepped from the ether, steady and measured in that teacher tone she'd used to quiet classrooms full of fidgety kids, recounting how in her 20s during the farm crisis, when interest rates choked the life out of smallholders like us, she'd partnered reluctantly with a sleazy investor named Ellis Langford Yell in full, the initials jumping out like a slap, with promises of saving our land from foreclosure through a development scheme that involved pooling parcels for a housing project on the outskirts of Medina, only for him to swindle her out of her shares with forged signatures and backroom deals that funneled the profits into his pockets, while leaving her to scrape by on teaching wages and odd jobs. Her words laced with a regret that twisted my gut because this EL was the shadowy figure whose empire Mark later absorbed through a distant family marriage tie he'd bragged about once over Thanksgiving turkey, explaining the sudden influx of capital that launched his career from modest flips to those sprawling McMansions dotting the landscape. The tape delved deeper as the minutes ticked by in the barn's quiet, Mom describing how she'd confronted Mark privately 2 years before her cancer diagnosis during a tense visit to the mansion where he'd been showing off his latest closing, warning him point-blank to come clean about the tainted roots of his fortune or face exposure through old ledgers she'd squirreled away, but he laughed it off with that patronizing pat on her hand, promising to take care of the family in his way, which now reeked of the subtle intimidation that kept her lips sealed until she hid this proof as her final safeguard against the wolves at the door, her voice fading into static with a heartfelt plea to use it wisely, not for blind destruction that could harm innocents like the kids, but for justice that righted the scales, leaving me slumped on a hay bale with tears streaking my face in the lantern's glow, the weight of generational theft crashing down because this wasn't just about money pilfered from Mom's sweat, it was her dreams stolen, funneled into the very mansion Mark claimed as his trophy while using it to paint me as the unfit parent in court, and my children caught in the crossfire of his greed that now threatened to pull them under if I didn't act. The dilemma hit harder the next morning when Jack arrived for his supervised weekend visit, the 10-year-old bounding out of the social worker's car with his backpack slung over one shoulder and that gap-toothed grin lighting up the porch, his hug tentative at first, but warming as he explored the farmhouse with wide-eyed curiosity, chattering nonstop about school projects on Ohio history and how Dad's new apartment felt too big and echoey without the pool, his innocence piercing through my vengeful fog like sunlight through storm clouds because sharing the full truth about the tape could scar him with adult messes too soon, yet withholding it meant letting Mark's lies fester and keep custody tilted in his favor, a moral tangle that had me second-guessing every choice as I watched him chase fireflies in the yard that evening, their lights blinking like fleeting hopes against the encroaching dusk. Tom confronted me outright that night over a makeshift dinner of canned chili heated on the stove, his face reddening when he spotted the open box on the counter and demanded to know what inheritance nonsense I was hiding, his bluster cracking like thin ice when I mentioned EL and the scam's echoes in Mark's deals. forcing a tense admission over the clatter of spoons that he'd known fragments peripherally through Dad's old drinking buddies who griped about Langford's tactics, but stayed quiet hoping for a cut of the action himself. A revelation that shattered any lingering illusions of brotherly support and ignited my resolve to push forward alone if needed. Fueled by that betrayal, I slipped details from the tape into an anonymous packet of photocopied ledgers and clippings, mailing it off to Mark's key business partners that afternoon from the post office in town with a cover note framed as insider concerns about historical fraud risks, and by the next day, as Jack napped on the couch amid scattered comic books, news alerts pinged on my phone about a major client pulling out of Mark's latest project citing due diligence issues. Their leaked email chain buzzing online with his increasingly desperate replies, a satisfying irony that had me chuckling softly to myself in the kitchen as I pictured him scrambling like the weasel he'd always been. That load of inherited baloney finally unraveling at the seams and costing him the smooth image he prized above all. But as Jack stirred from his nap with questions about staying longer and Tom packed up his tools in a huff after our blowout, muttering threats about contesting the will, headlights pierced the deepening dark from the road. A sleek black sedan pulling up the drive that I recognized instantly from countless arrivals at school events, Mark's, his silhouette stepping out with purposeful strides toward the porch light, and my hand tightened around the tape still tucked in my drawer upstairs, the trump card burning like a live wire in the quiet night, ready to spark a confrontation that could either free me or chain us all in flames I hadn't anticipated. Mark's arrival at the farmhouse door that midnight felt like the universe dealing its last hand in a poker game where I'd finally drawn the wild card, his knock sharp and entitled as if he still owned the deed to this place along with the remnants of my shattered life. And I let him in against every screaming instinct to bolt the locks and call the sheriff, the living room lit by a single lamp on the side table that cast his face in harsh shadows accentuating the new lines of stress etched around his eyes, lines that hadn't been there before the leaks I'd orchestrated started biting into his carefully manicured world of boardrooms and backroom handshakes. He stepped inside with that familiar cologne wafting like an unwelcome memory, the kind he'd splash on before charity galas where he'd pose as the family man philanthropist, and his opening line dripped with a mix of forced charm and underlying threat. "Sarah, we need to talk about these ridiculous rumors floating around town for the kid's sake if nothing else," but I caught the flicker of real fear in his eyes. The man who'd once swept me off my feet with visions of endless summers by the pool now reduced to bluffing on my sagging porch. His polished loafers tracking mud across the rug Mom had woven by hand during those long evenings when she'd spin yarns about perseverance to keep us going. I gestured him toward the armchair that had been Dad's favorite, its fabric worn thin from years of stories told over evening pipes, and poured coffee from the percolator still warm on the counter. Strong and black like the resolve I'd been building brick by brick since the courtroom, stalling while my mind raced through the tape's revelations upstairs in the drawer. The proof of his bloodline to that swindler Ellis Langford who'd cheated Mom out of her stake in the land deals that seeded his fortune, a dirty lineage that explained why he'd isolated me from her in those final chemo-ridden years, whispering doubts about her senile ramblings to keep the truth buried deeper than the safe itself. We circled each other verbally at first like wary cats in the dim light, him denying everything with that practiced smile he'd flashed at depositions to sway the judge, probing casually about the farmhouse's quirks. Evelyn always was the sentimental type, hiding junk in walls like some hoarder until the words stuck in my throat no longer, and I couldn't hold back the flood, sliding a typed transcript of the cassette across the scarred coffee table with a steady hand I'd faked through sheer spite honed from months of powerlessness, watching his color drain like water down a sink as he scanned Mom's account of the swindle, her voice captured in print implicating his family in the fraud that ballooned into the millions he paraded as self-made success. The same tainted roots that let him snatch the mansion and tilt custody in his favor by hiring so-called experts to discredit her memory even after she was gone, painting her as unreliable to bolster his narrative of me as the unstable ex. For a split second, raw vulnerability cracked his facade like thin ice underfoot, him muttering about how it was just business in tough times, no one really got hurt beyond a few signatures. His voice pitching higher as he leaned forward with that old manipulative edge, but I called his bluff outright, laying out how I'd already shared redacted snippets with Lisa's contacts at the district attorney's office through anonymous channels she'd set up to protect whistleblowers, enough to launch a quiet investigation into his dealings without my name splashed across headlines, a clever sidestep that turned his empire's own spotlight inward like a funhouse mirror, distorting his smug reflection, forcing audits and paper trails to unravel the creative accounting he'd relied on for years. The satisfaction bloomed warm in my chest when he shifted in the chair, his knee bouncing like it used to during our early date. Nights when he'd fret over closing costs, offering a desperate olive branch, "We can settle this quietly, Sarah. Joint custody papers drawn up tomorrow. Even put the house back in play for you." But I laughed then. A bitter bark that echoed off the walls lined with Mom's faded quilts, because this trump card she'd hidden wasn't for haggling like one of his property flips. It was for reckoning, a witty payback in the form of exposure that hit him square where it hurt most. His reputation among those golf buddies and investors who'd once toasted his every toast as the king of Cleveland real estate, now whispering about skeletons in the closet that could tank deals faster than a market crash. As dawn crept in through the curtains, painting the room in pale grays that softened the edges of our standoff, he drove off in defeat with tail lights fading down the gravel like retreating thunder, leaving behind a silence that hummed with possibility, the weight of the confrontation lifting just enough for me to breathe deep for the first time since the gavel fell, the revenge not in some explosive takedown that would scar the kids, but in the slow burn of truth seeping out. Precise and ironic like Mom's poker strategies where she'd fold early to lure opponents into overplaying their hand. Emily and Jack came that weekend as promised, the air lighter in the farmhouse as we walked the fields hand in hand. Emily opening up about the tensions at Mark's place with his new girlfriend's drama, and Jack pointing out wildflowers he remembered from visits here, sharing stories without me dumping the full weight of the tape's secrets yet. My choice to shield them earning tentative hugs and laughter over pancakes I flipped on the old griddle, even if it meant disagreeing with my own vengeful impulses that whispered to spill everything for catharsis, a moral tightrope where protecting their innocence clashed with the justice I craved. But as we sat on the mended porch swing that afternoon, the wood creaking under our weight like an old friend settling in, a plain envelope arrived in the mailbox with no return address. Just a glossy photo of the mansion now sporting a for sale sign staked crooked in the manicured lawn and a scrawled note in Tom's unmistakable chicken scratch. "Heard you played your hand big, careful, sis. Some debts from the past come calling when you least expect." And not all players fold easy, leaving me staring at the horizon where the sun dipped low over the cornstalks, uncertainty looming larger than the victory I'd tasted in Mark's paling face, wondering if Mom's secret had truly reclaimed my life and the kids' futures or merely traded one heavy silence for another laced with shadows. The farmhouse's quiet now holding more questions than answers, like whether justice ever seals the deal completely or just flips the table to start a new round, darker and more unpredictable, with Emily's curious glance my way pulling me back to the moment. Her voice soft as she asked if everything was really going to be okay, and me nodding with a smile that hid the doubt gnawing inside.